Moves to Innocence 2, Settler Adoption Fantasies. Describing acts of passing, Sarah Ahmed asserts the importance of being able to replace, quote-unquote, the stranger, or take the place of the other in the consolidation and reaffirmation of white identity. To become without becoming is to reproduce the other as not I, within rather than beyond the structure of the I. End quote. Shireen Razak, reading Ahmed, tells us that appropriating the other's pain occurs when we think we are recognizing not only the other's pain, but his or her difference. Difference becomes the conduit of identification in much the same way as pain does. Discussing the film Dances with Wolves, a cinematic fiction of a Union soldier in the postbellum Civil War era who befriends and protects the Lakota Sioux, are represented as a noble, dying race. Ahmed critically engages the narrative in which a white man, played by Kevin Costner, comes to respect the Sioux, to the point of being able to dance their dances. The white man, in his example, is able to become without becoming. He alone is transformed through his encounter with the Sioux, while they remain the mechanism for his transformation. He becomes the authentic knower, while they remain what is to be known and consumed and spit out again, as good Indians who confirm the white man's position as hero of the story. The Sioux remain objects, while Kevin Costner is able to go anywhere and be anything. This is from Ahmed's analysis, as discussed by Razak. End quote. For the purposes of this article, we locate the desire to become without becoming, in brackets Indian, within settler adoption fantasies. These fantasies can mean the adoption of indigenous practices and knowledge, but more, refer to those narratives in the settler colonial imagination in which the native, understanding that he is becoming extinct, hands over his land, his claim to the land, and his very Indianness to the settler for safekeeping. This is a fantasy that is invested in a settler futurity and dependent on the foreclosure of an indigenous futurity. Settler adoption fantasies are long-standing narratives in the United States, fueled by rare instances of ceremonial adoptions, from John Smith's adoption in 1607 by Pocahontas' father, to Lewis Henry Morgan's adoption in 1847 by Seneca member Jimmy Johnson, to the recent adoption of actor Johnny Depp by the family of LaDonna Harris, a Comanche woman and social activist. As sovereign nations, tribes make decisions about who is considered a member. So our interest is not in whether adoptions are appropriate or legitimate. Rather, because the prevalence of the adoption narrative in American literature, film, television, holidays, and history books far exceeds the actual occurrences of adoptions, we are interested in how this narrative spins a fantasy that an individual settler can become innocent, indeed heroic or indigenized, against the backdrop of national guilt. The adoption fantasy is the mythical trump card desired by critical settlers who feel remorse about settler colonialism, one that absolves them from the inheritance of settler crimes and that bequeaths a new inheritance of nativeness and claims to land, which is a reaffirmation of what the settler project has been all along. To explain more fully, we turn to perhaps the most influential version of the adoption narrative, penned by James Fenimore Cooper in 1823 through 1841. James Fenimore, son of, quote, that genius in land speculation, William Cooper, end quote, grew up in Six Nations territory that his father had grabbed and named after himself as Cooperstown, New York. In these Iroquois lakes, forests, and hills, James Fenimore and his later daughter Susan imagined for themselves frontier romances full of tragic Indians, inventive and compassionate settlers, and virginal white/Indian women in virgin wilderness. Cooper's 5-book series, collectively called the Leatherstocking Tales, are foundational in the emergence of American literature. Melville called Cooper, quote, our national author, end quote, and it was no exaggeration. His were the most widely read novels of the time, and in the age of the printing press, this meant they were the most circulated books in a U.S. print-based popular culture. Mass print established national language and identity and, quote-unquote, imagined community, end quote, from which emerges a so-called America as a nation as opposed to just an assortment of former colonies. The tales are credited with the constructions of the vanishing Indian, the resourceful frontiersman, and the degenerate N-word, the pivotal triad of archetypes that forms the basis for an American national literature. The Last of Mohicans is undoubtedly the most famous among the tales and has been remade into 3 separate television series in 1957, 71, and 2004, an opera in 1977, a BBC radio adaptation in 1995, a 2007 Marvel comic book series, a stage drama in performance since 2010, and 11 separate films spanning 1912 to 1992. In a sense, Last of the Mohicans is a national narrative that has never stopped being remade. Across all 5 books, Cooper's epic hero is Natty Bumppo, a white man, quote-unquote, gone native, at home in nature, praised for his wisdom and ways that are both Indian and white. In Last of the Mohicans, this hero becomes the adopted son of Chingachgook, fictional chief of the fictional tribe Mohicans, who renames Natty, Nathaniel Hawkeye, thus legitimating and completing his indigeneity. At the same time, Chingachgook conveniently fades into extinction. In a critical symbolic gesture, Chingachgook hands over his son, Uncas, the last of the Mohicans, to the adopted indigenous white man, Hawkeye. When Uncas dies, the ramification is obvious. Hawkeye becomes, without becoming, the last of the Mohicans. You are now one of us. You are now native. Quote, the pale faces are masters of the earth, and the time of the red men has not yet come again, end quote. Cooper's books fantasize the founding and expansion of the U.S. settler nation by fictionalizing the period of 1740 through 1804, distilled into the single narrative of one man. The arc of his life stands in for the narrative of national development. The heroic settler, Natty Bumppo, transitions from British trapper to Native American, to prairie pioneer in the new western frontier. Interestingly, the books themselves were written in reverse chronological order, starting with the pioneer, going backwards in time. Through such historical hypnosis, settler literature fabricates past lives, all the way back to an Indian past. I am American becomes I was frontiersman, was British, was Indian. In this fantasy, Hawkeye is both adopter and adoptee. The act of adopting indigenous ways makes him deserving to be adopted by the indigenous. Settler fantasies of adoption alleviate the anxiety of settler unbelonging. He adopts the love of land and therefore thinks he belongs to the land. He is a first environmentalist and sentimentalist, nostalgic for vanishing native ways. In today's jargon, he could be thought of as an eco-activist, naturalist, and Indian sympathizer. At the same time, his cultural hybridity is what makes him more fit to survive, the ultimate social Darwinism, better than both British and Indian. He is the mythical American. Hawkeye, hybrid white and Indian, becomes the reluctant but nonetheless rightful inheritor of the land and warden of its vanishing people. Similarly, the settler intellectual who hybridizes decolonial thought with Western critical traditions, metaphorizing decolonization, emerges superior to both native intellectuals and continental theorists simultaneously. With his critical hawk eye, he again sees the critique better than anyone and sees the world from a loftier station. It is a fiction, just as Cooper's hawk eye, just as the adoption, just as the belonging. In addition to fabricating historical memory, the tales serve to generate historical amnesia. The books were published between 1823 and 1841, at the height of the Jacksonian period, with the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and subsequent Trail of Tears from 1831 through 1837. During this time, 46,000 Native Americans were removed from their homelands, opening 25 million acres of land for resettlement. The tales are not only silent on Indian removal, but narrate the Indian as vanishing in an earlier time frame, and thus indigenous people are already dead prior to removal. Performing sympathy is critical to Cooper's project of settler innocence. It is no accident that he is often read as a sympathizer to the Indians, despite the fact that he didn't know any, in contrast to Jackson's policies of removal and genocide. Cooper is cast as the innocent father of U.S. ideology, in contrast to the bad white men of history. Performing suffering is also critical to Cooper's project of settler innocence. Hawkeye takes on the imagined demeanor of the vanishing native, brooding, vengeful, protecting a dying way of life, and unsuccessful in finding a mate and producing offspring. Thus, sympathy and suffering are the tokens used to absorb the native other's difference, coded as pain, the not I, into the I. The settler's personal suffering feeds his fantasy of mutuality. The 2011 film, The Descendants, is a modern remake of the adoption fantasy, blended with a healthy dose of settler nativism. George Clooney's character, King, is a Haole hypo-descendant of the last surviving princess of Hawaii and reluctant inheritor of a massive expanse of land, the last wilderness on the island of Kauai. In contrast to his obnoxious settler cousins, he earns the privilege as an overworked lawyer rather than relying on his unearned inheritance. Furthermore, Clooney's character suffers. He is a dysfunctional father, heading a dysfunctional family, watching his wife wither away in a coma, learning that she cheated on him. And so he is somehow Hawaiian at heart. Because pain is the token for oppression, claims to pain then equate to claims of being an innocent non-oppressor. By the film's end, King goes against the wishes of his profiteering settler cousins and chooses to keep the land, reluctantly accepting that his is the steward of the land, a responsibility bequeathed upon him as an accident of birth. This is the denouement of reconciliation between the settler I and the interiorized native not I within the settler. Sympathy and suffering are profoundly satisfying for settler cinema. The Descendants was nominated for 5 Academy Awards and won for Best Adapted Screenplay in 2012. The beauty of this settler fantasy is that it adopts decolonization and aborts it in one gesture. Hawkeye adopts Uncas and then conveniently dies. King adopts Hawaii and negates the necessity for Ea, Kanaka Maoli sovereignty. Decolonization is stillborn, rendered irrelevant, because decolonization is already completed by the indigenized consciousness of the settler. Now, we are all Indian, all Hawaiian, and decolonization is no longer an issue. Our only recourse is to move forward, however regretfully, with our settler future. In the unwritten decolonial version of Cooper's story, Hawkeye would lose his land back to the Mohawk, the real people upon whose land Cooperstown was built and whose rivers, lakes, and forests Cooper mined for his frontier romances. Hawkeye would shoot his last arrow or his last long rifle shot, return his eagle feather, and would be renamed Natty Bumppo, settler on native land. The story would end with the moment of this recognition. Unresolved are the questions. Would a conversation follow after that between native and the last settler? Would the settler leave or just vanish? Would he ask to stay? And if he did, who would say yes? These are questions that will be addressed at decolonization and not a priori in order to appease anxieties for a settler future.